Hi there. Welcome to the replay of our July 24th webcast on SOC 2 and the changes that become effective in December 2018. I know you've been busy with GDPR and this year's audit, so maybe you haven't had time to deal with the SOC 2 changes yet. That's okay, but I highly recommend that you develop an action plan soon if you haven't done so already. If you plan ahead, the changes shouldn't be a problem, and you can avoid some unnecessary stress during the audit process. As I discussed on the webcast, the criteria have been restructured. A number of new criteria have been added. Detailed guidance has been added for each of the criteria, nearly 200 items for security alone. And there are some new requirements for the content of the report. For example, you need to define what your service commitments to customers are, and you may need to disclose certain incidents in your report. If you have any questions or need any assistance in preparing for the SOC 2 changes, we're here to help. Feel free to email or call us. Now enjoy the webcast.
All right, thanks everyone for joining today's webcast. To the point, are you ready for the new SOC 2? The SOC 2 reporting standard has been changed pretty significantly. Those changes will be effective December 15th of this year. So just wanted to have this session to go through the key changes and the impact. I'm Mark Lundeen. I'm the owner of Lundeen & Company. We provide audit and consulting services focused on security, privacy, and technology. We work with high growth startups to established companies. Prior to forming this firm, I have 20 years of experience and led a cloud and security assurance practice for a Big Four firm. So I'm going to start off and give just a quick overview of SOC 2 so everyone's on the same page. I'll talk about the changes to SOC 2, their impact, some common SOC 2 challenges, particularly as they relate to this new framework, go through some key takeaways, and answer questions at the end. If we don't have time for questions at the end, feel free to shoot me questions, and I can get back to you directly. So just to recap, there are various types of SOC reports. The nomenclature has changed a bit. They're now referred to as system and organization control reports. We have SOC 1, 2, and 3 reports that most people are pretty familiar with. SOC 1 that focuses on internal control over financial reporting. SOC 2, which is the focus of our discussion today, which focuses on security, availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, or privacy. We have SOC 3, which is a summary version of the SOC 2. And then the AICPA developed a new framework, SOC for cybersecurity, that can deal with enterprise-wide or business unit cybersecurity risk management. And time will tell how much demand there is for that type of third-party reporting, but there is a framework in place to do that. With these various SOC reports, we have Type 1 and Type 2 reports. Type 1 reports cover the design of controls as of a point in time, whereas the Type 2 report covers design and operating effectiveness over a period of time. Typically, you'll want to receive a Type 2 report to get comfort over a vendor or third party's controls, but sometimes the Type 1 report will be a good tool, particularly for a new service, for a newer company, or the first time they're going through the whole SOC examination process. Now, with SOC 2, there are 5 areas that can be covered. These used to be referred to as the principles. Now they're referred to as categories. So security is really the baseline that needs to be covered. We also have availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy, which are incremental requirements that build on security and the common controls. So those are the areas that are typically covered. Most frequently, SOC 2 reports tend to cover security, availability, and confidentiality. We don't see a lot of reports covering processing integrity because most service providers that are doing transaction processing, customers are going to require that they provide a SOC 1 report, and that would cover off those types of controls. We also don't see a lot of SOC 2 reports covering privacy because privacy is more focused on when you're interacting directly with the end users, the individual customers, and collecting their personal information. In most cases with SOC 2 reports, we're talking about more business-to-business services where, as a service provider, you're not necessarily dealing with the end individuals, and oftentimes confidentiality is more applicable. And between security and confidentiality, you would cover off what are you doing to protect that data, however it was obtained. So moving to the new SOC 2 criteria structure, there's core components. So there's the description criteria, certain things that you need to describe in the report itself about your systems and processes. There's the common criteria. The first section is the biggest change to SOC 2. A set of 17 new criteria based on the COSO framework have been added. If you've worked with public companies and have dealt with Sarbanes-Oxley, you're probably very, very familiar with COSO. It's a framework that was developed many years ago to deal with enterprise risk management, financial fraud, those types of things. But it's still a good overall risk management framework. It got incorporated into SOC 2 as part of the AICPA's effort to build this SOC for cybersecurity reporting framework. They wanted to have a real enterprise risk management framework, and they chose the COSO framework. At the same time, those changes were incorporated into SOC 2. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. Then there's a set of security or common criteria, and then you can add on availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, and privacy. Another change that has occurred with the update to SOC 2 is the concept of points of focus. In the past, the SOC report guidance had illustrative controls or examples of controls for each of the criteria. In some cases, they weren't great examples. In the early days, some people might use those controls as a template or as a starting point, but they weren't great. They were just examples. With the update to SOC 2, the AICPA has tightened that up, incorporated these points of focus. So for each of the specific criteria, say you're dealing with physical access, there'll be one or more specific points that you should consider when you're designing your controls to meet those criteria, whether you're evaluating your controls or whether the auditor is looking at them. The SOC 2 guidance is very clear. As part of the SOC 2 audit, you're not being audited against each of these points of focus, but the perspective is these are things that are generally relevant to those criteria. So as you prepare for a SOC 2 exam, using the new criteria, you should really go through those points of focus and make sure that you're considering those points, that there's nothing really important that you haven't addressed, because that's something that could come up at the audit phase. So the COSO piece, the COSO piece really can add a lot of overhead to the SOC compliance process and the SOC audit itself if you're not careful with how you plan that out. So the SOC 2 criteria, the first of the core components that I touched on is the description criteria. You have in the SOC 2 report, management needs to be clear on what services are covered. There's added emphasis on, as a service provider, what are your principal service commitments? What are you contractually agreeing to do? What are you agreeing to do in service level agreements? And then also what system requirements do you have? And to clearly document that within the report. And at the end of the session, I will send a copy of the presentation to everyone. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to send them in on the Q&A chat, and I'll either cover them as we go along or at the end. So this emphasis on service commitments and system requirements is there. You have to describe the components of the system, from the infrastructure to the data that's covered. A new component is relevant incidents. So if you had any significant incidents during the period covered by the SOC report, you may need to describe those incidents in the SOC 2 report. The way the requirement is worded, it's for incidents that result from control failures or significant failure to achieve service commitments or system requirements. So I think in most cases it would be a situation where you had a significant exception, or you might even have a qualification. In those cases, if the issue was related to an incident, you would need to describe to some extent what was the incident and what did you do to address it. And the rest of the topics, there's really no change from the prior version. This slide just summarizes the COSO criteria topic. So it's covers off everything from control environment to control activities. For a larger, well-established company, pretty much all of these things would typically exist to support the normal activities of the board and to support the SOX compliance efforts. But getting the company to change or tweak some of those processes to fit specific SOC 2 reporting to the board, and potentially involvement of the board within some of the SOC 2 processes, is something that will probably take some careful planning, will require some lead time. So you'll really want to think that through. On the flip side, for smaller companies, startups, rapidly growing companies, newer companies, maybe you have some of this in place, depending on how involved the board is, how focused they are on security. But there's a lot of material to digest in the COSO criteria and all the points of focus. So you'll really want to take some time to come up with the right controls, the right processes that fit your company, achieve the goals here, but don't become a huge burden for the company. And then the final core component are the common criteria related to security. That's all the criteria around logical and physical access, around system operations, change management, and risk mitigation. The criteria for logical access in particular, I would say, have been tightened up a bit from the past. If you've been through a SOC 2, or if you have read older SOC 2 reports, For logical access, you tend to see a lot of repetition in the reports, a lot of the same controls referenced over and over again. With this update, it's been tightened up a little bit. There's some clearer points of focus. So ideally, you won't see as much repetition, and you'll have controls that more specifically address some of these points. Change management is an interesting topic. Particularly as we deal with companies that have a DevOps environment or CI/CD methodology. You're really going to want to go through these points of focus that talk about things like authorization to begin development, approval, testing, and really think through that to see what makes sense in your environment. How are you really addressing those risk points? Because as SOC 2 is written, it's really written from a traditional software development and change management perspective. So you'll just want to make sure that I recommend looking at your process. Where do you have automated controls built in? Where could you build in an automated control? And how do you demonstrate to an auditor that you are doing testing, that you are getting approval for things that are being released into production? Moving to the next slide. With SOC 2, you have to cover those components that that I just covered off. You have to have a clear description. You have to cover off the COSO components. You have to cover off the security requirements. A number of companies also cover availability. The most challenging component of that tends to be disaster recovery, demonstrating that you have a plan, demonstrating that you are backing things up properly, and that you are testing recovery. I spoke to processing integrity, which is really a general framework for covering various types of processing. And then confidentiality, really focuses on, well, how do you identify what information is confidential, and how do you ensure that it's kept confidential? Moving to the next slide, we have privacy, which is becoming an area of increasing interest with GDPR coming into place, with the new California data privacy law passing and coming into effect in a bit. This is how the SOC 2 privacy criteria are structured. It hasn't really changed all that much from the prior version. And then this is just a good summary here. I see some companies using the SOC 2 privacy framework, linking that with GDPR and other frameworks or requirements to just make sure they've got the right controls in place. Typically from an internal self-assessment perspective, or to be prepared when specific customers come in, not so much as part of the SOC 2 itself, for the reasons I mentioned before. So that's really a quick summary of the things that have changed. So the new criteria, they're mandatory for periods ending on or after December 15th. So if you've got a 12/31 period end, or a spring or summer period end, you're going to want to get moving on this if you haven't done so already. There's a greater emphasis on service commitments and system requirements. so I think it's gonna be important, if you already haven't done it, to sort of have a clear picture. Well, what are the specific service commitments we're making it's pretty straightforward if you have standard contracts that you don't modify, but it gets a bit more complicated if if you don't have a standard contract, or if you're agreeing to a lot of one-off changes to accommodate specific customers. So you really need to think through with those commitments, what are the baseline commitments that you're making across customers, and what are maybe the one-off things where you've got a special arrangement with a customer, and maybe you don't include that in scope because you're only doing it for them, and that's very clear. We've got the 17 new COSO-based criteria that have been added. From the various companies I've talked to, I don't see a lot of people that are necessarily see a lot of value with that. With the update to SOC 2, there hasn't really been a lot of change to the specific technical requirements, but a lot of there's the risk that you could have a lot of overhead if you're not really careful with how you address those criteria and the process you lay out. These points of focus, they're guidance, they're not requirements, but you can't ignore them. The SOC 2 guidance is clear. Management's not required to address each and every one of them. You're not being audited against them, but they're there. And if there's a question, are your controls sufficient or not, an auditor is going to look to those points of focus and say, hey, well, how are you addressing these items that are generally relevant to the criteria? As I mentioned, if you've got a DevOps environment, you're going to have to be prepared to clearly change how are you maintaining segregation to the extent as possible? How are you automating controls? How are you making sure changes are being completely tracked, approved, and so forth? And as you look at how you're managing your cloud infrastructure, say you have an AWS environment, you may have a wide range of accounts that are set up. You may be using a wide variety of different tools. Different product teams or different development teams might be using different tools for monitoring. How are you handling configuration management? There's a lot of things that are in some ways more complex in the cloud environment, and you want to make sure that you can clearly show how you're covering off the risk points. So that's that's a summary of the changes. I think they're fairly straightforward, but they can have a pretty significant impact if you don't get started on them early and allow yourself enough time to deal with them. With that, I'll open it up to any questions that there might be. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining. If you have any questions or just want to bounce some ideas off of someone, absolutely feel free to email or call. I'd be happy to discuss further, and I'll send out a copy of the presentation shortly. Thanks, everyone.